All right, let's talk standard, everybody. That's going to be the first 4 rounds today, the first 4 rounds tomorrow on Saturday, and of course our top 8 will be standard as well. It's going to be the more important format of the 2 here this weekend at our Season 2 Invitational weekend. So, I said we worked ourselves into an actual pretty good standard format because we had to ban a lot of cards to get here, but we got here, and it's actually pretty fun. There's diversity, we see a lot of different decks, there's a lot of different strategies, but I think, Patrick, you can say, along with everybody else, there is a best deck. It is Temur Energy with Attune with Ether, Long Tusk Cub, Bristling Hydra, Glorybringer, Whirl of Virtuoso, good mana, not a ton of mana because of Attune. It's a really, really good deck. I think it's got to be the deck to be coming in.
Yep, a bunch of the best rates available in the format, a lot of synergies inside the deck, plays offense and defense very efficiently. The question for me is how inbred are builds of this deck going to be for the mirror match?
Sure.
You can go into a lot of 4 and 5 mana cards that generate value on the table that are 2-for-1s. A lot of those cards don't necessarily perform well against the red decks or some of the control decks of the format. So that for me is going to be the real question for people deciding to bring this deck. Are you really inbred to fight the mirror match, or do you acknowledge that there's other strategies available and have more of a, centrist style to the strategy?
Matthias, there is the 4-color build, of course, with the Scarab God and Vraska and different sideboard cards. A lot of different things you can do with this strategy. But as Patrick mentioned, you can get inbred if you want to, but there are other decks out there that you have to beat.
Yeah, there's other decks out there that you have to beat. Now, right now, Temur, to me, when I'm playing Standard, it feels really just like a Jund deck of the format, where, yeah, this is this good rate creatures, some removal, not too much removal. It's kind of just pound for pound playing the best cards. I'm interested to see when the players move away, like try to win the mirror, how much it's going to cost them in the other matchups. You look at cards like Glorybringer, an excellent card, but then again, if you're just playing Glorybringer mirrors all day, well, that becomes less good. There are these options where you can start playing these black cards and like bigger threats to win the mirror, but it costs you in other places.
Yeah, that's the question, right? Is how inbred do you want to get for this particular tournament? You're in a strong field. This is also the top 8 as well. If your goals or intentions are to win this tournament, Ryan, you might think, okay, I'm going to be Temur Energy 2, 3, upwards of 4 times this weekend, so maybe I do want the Scarab God. Maybe I do want Vraska, but if I do that, I might get pounded by like Blue-White Approach or God Pharaoh's Gift. So what do you do?
I think that the most important thing is that if your main deck is going to focus on winning the energy mirror, and I think it's reasonable to expect you'll play more energy mirrors than any other matchup, but you have to leave the negates and the spell pierces in your sideboard.
Sure.
It's very important to have those tools available for a 3-game set against Blue-White Approach. I think as long as you maintain that, you'll still be pretty reasonable against them. Yeah. And it's not like these decks are winning a ton of game 1s in that matchup anyway. So it's really higher pressure on your sideboard, but I think that the tools are still available unless you just go ham and have 75 cards for the mirror.
Yeah, which I don't think we're going to see people do. I mean, it's an option. And again, it's going to be the most played deck here this weekend in Standard, almost certainly. I think there's no argument to be had there about Temur Energy or 4-color Energy, however you want to group them. So it'll be interesting to see how players kind of approach that aspect of the Standard tournament. But as we mentioned, there are other decks. Now, Matthias, Rainap Red is not a deck I think you would play. I could be wrong.
I like decks with a singular focus, and Ramanap Red does check that box for me. Okay. Right? I mean, would I play it? No, if I want a singular focus, we're going to get to some of the other decks I'll be playing later. They involve blue cards. But Ramanap Red has still been it's been a very powerful deck. I would say it is solidly the number 2 deck right now in Standard.
I think it's very, very good.
It is very good. If I think going to this tournament, if you didn't want to play Temur Energy, this is the other deck I'd point you toward.
Now, Ryan, we're talking about, of course, Hazoret, which is a fantastic card. Rampaging Ferocidon, Harsh Mentor, that got Lightning Strike. It still has Bomac Courier, Shock, good enough, obviously, for the metagame. And, of course, the Deserts and Ramunap Ruins and Sunscorched Desert itself. What do you think about this deck? Again, Matthias talking about decks with singular focus. This isn't your Jund deck, but we have seen red decks beat Jund-esque decks like Temur Energy in the past.
And I think that, I was talking earlier about Temur Energy in our sideboard. I think for the red deck, it's imperative to have the correct main deck.
Sure.
There's not a ton you can do with your sideboard. You have options. There's a lot of good red cards in Standard, but you have to be able to win that Temur matchup, and I think that if you can't win game 1, you're in trouble. I think that main decking Harsh Mentor, moving in that direction, has been very, very good for this deck. That's going to hit cards like Whirl of Virtuoso, which is a really big problem with your deck that has to come through in the combat step. I really like the red deck's position. If you have a good 60 and certainly a good 75, it's a great pick for the weekend, but this is a deck more than some of the others in Standard where you have to have the reps in and have a good metagame read.
Yeah, it's an interesting red deck, Patrick. Now this, I know you haven't played a ton of Standard, but this is a red deck that's definitely up your alley. There's a lot of decision making. There's a lot of slots to kind of mess around with. We've seen people move towards Harsh Mentor because of this metagame. Rampaging Ferocidon's basically a 4 of nowadays in this particular style of deck. That card being very, very good, the 3-mana dinosaur from Ixalan. Hazoret's the key component, but it's not so much a Hazoret deck anymore. It can actually win without drawing it and be a pretty good deck. Now, if you do draw it, it's kind of easy mode, but the fact that the deck can win without it's got to be pretty appealing to players this weekend.
Definitely, and I would like to echo Ryan's sentiment that I think getting the main deck down is really critical.
Sure.
Because post-board, you can have cards like Harsh Mentor and Rampaging Ferocidon, and they'll be fine in the appropriate spots, but your opponents are going to be bringing in a lot more removal. So the ceiling on those cards go down because the odds that it just goes unchecked over a long game is very low.
Yes.
Game 1 is where your opponent's going to be struggling to cobble together enough removal, and so having the right threats for the metagame, like Harsh Mentor, like Rampaging Ferocidon, I think is really important, and you've seen these red decks slowly move from those cards that read like sideboard cards and moving into the main deck because the matchups they want them for are so common, and because post-board, I mean, they're good sometimes, but usually they're just running into post-board removal spells.
Yeah, and you got to overload that removal with a lot of creatures if you can. So I think that is kind of the consensus second best deck in Standard. And then you kind of get to the fringe players. Ryan, I'm going to start with you. Blue-White Approach, a deck that, I mean, it kind of, well, it won Grand Prix Atlanta. It was Esper Approach, so it's definitely a deck that people can play and win with. It's not, I would say, the prettiest deck on paper. It's got a lot of do-nothing into approach, and then it's got this weird sideboard plan of creatures that everyone knows is coming, but they still do it, and it still kind of works. So, you've got Approach, you've got Fumigate, Settle the Wreckage, Glimmer of Genius, all this stuff. I look at this deck on paper and I say, I don't understand how this deck wins, but it continues to. What am I not seeing here?
So this is the kind of deck that I would certainly classify as good enough.
Sure.
And it's going to be picked up by the players that you'd have to claw the basic island and basic planes out of their cold, dead hands.
So Matthias then, okay.
Sure.
Got it.
Yeah, they're going to play this deck no matter what. And the tools are there. It can certainly win games. And I think that Blue-White Approach, it kind of has the dredge factor where it wins a lot of game ones. And the problem is that there's some really good sideboard cards against this deck. Negate is super powerful, and we're trying to resolve 5, 7 mana spells. Spell Pierce even does a job most of the time, so you go for these Regal Caracales. But there's also that dance there, right, where you want to bring in Spell Pierce, and it's still going to be good, but you have to be able to beat the cat. And it looks kind of like a limited rare, but it certainly performs in Constructed. I don't like playing against Regal Caracal if I'm playing Ramunap Red.
Sure.
So the deck, it has the tools. You can pilot it well. The ceiling, I think, is lower than a deck like Team Energy, but this is just the style for a lot of players, and it's there. It's a quality deck. It's probably not the best deck. It probably doesn't have the capability of being the best deck, but it can put up wins.
Patrick, I'll come to you. Matthias, I'm going to save you for last.
Right,
Trust
all
me. This is a deck I can't imagine you ever playing, but it's a deck that I imagine you preparing for a Standard tournament you have to beat, because you'll probably play it once or twice over the course of probably this particular weekend. What is your approach against this deck? Are you just trying to dodge it? Do you care about it? Is it something you don't even acknowledge being a deck? How do you feel about this deck?
Well, I think sort of a subtle metagame shift that's occurred in Standard is because the red deck and Teamer Energy are so prevalent, and because those decks are really good naturally at fighting Planeswalkers, that we've seen a lot of Planeswalker threats leave decks, and it's more about removals and the creatures that are more impactful on the battlefield. That's really good news for a blue-white control deck, because the Planeswalkers are the more problematic threats. All their random creatures, their Glorybringers, who cares about that kind of stuff? So you're picking up a lot of game ones. I think subtly you could start moving some Planeswalkers back into your deck and try to improve your matchup a little bit game one with cards that are, if you're playing with a bunch of Chandra Torture Defiances, those aren't bad necessarily against Red and Teamer, and they do a lot of work there. Then post-board, it's Negate, it's Duress, it's Spell Pierce. Are you able to beat that stuff reliably, I think is the big question.
All right, Blue-White Mage.
All right.
Azorius Magician himself.
Sure.
The king of do-nothing control. Talk to me about Approach.
So Approach, yeah, it's going to be the closest we've had to do-nothing control in a while. What's actually interesting about this for a control deck is that it's one of the weaker sideboarding decks in Standard right now. Which is a very strange place for control to be. This deck is a king in game ones, and a lot of times for the reasons that Patrick said, it's blanking cards out of other players' decks by not playing Planeswalkers, not really playing creatures. Your game ones are very good, and then you're scrapping a bit in your game twos. Teamer Energy is a huge deck right now, and once they start boarding in all these negates out of the sideboard, you have a lot more work to do. That said, I think if you want to just get this high percentage of game ones, which you sometimes see out of linear decks like this, this is a strategy you can do, and it will get that for you.
Is it a strategy you would do?
Probably. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough.
It would be the thing on the drive there. I would know that this is I should be playing Teamer, and then I'd register Approach.
All right. Hey, I can definitely appreciate that. As we move on to our next deck here, it's one of the wonky ones in the format, probably the most wonky, which is the God's Pharaoh gift deck. Pascal Maynard getting second place at Pro Tour Ixalan with this particular strategy. There's a couple different ways you can go, but the key card to the deck is, of course, God Pharaoh's Gift. You've got Champion of Witch. You've got Angel of Invention, which is going to, of course, get the job done. Some players play Refurbish. Some players play Gate of the Afterlife. There's various creatures you can play in the deck. All this other stuff. Patrick, this deck is weird, but it does kind of win. And if you do not acknowledge this being a deck, because it's so different from what everyone else is doing, if you might get paired against this deck and just go, I can't win. There's nothing I can do, and there's some appeal to that, I think.
Definitely. It's playing an unorthodox game of Magic, and just like with Blue-White Approach, if you want to have some Planeswalkers in your deck because they're just threat cards that happen to dial up that matchup a little bit, I think a Braid is a swing card here as well.
Sure.
It's been sidelined a little bit. Harness Lightning and Lightning Strike maybe are better for their appropriate decks. But if you respect the strategy, I think it's worth playing a couple copies of a Braid because those artifacts unchecked are really problematic. And much like Blue-White Approach, you're getting so many game ones as a result of people just not being able to interact with what you're doing. Your post-board games typically get a little bit tougher, but if you're picking up a ton of your game ones, you can live with that.
Now, Matthias, if people want to go after God's Pharaoh's Gift, it's not a particularly hard deck to beat, in my opinion.
Right.
But if people have kind of forgotten about this deck and their focus is on Teamer and Red and Approach and Sultai, which we'll get to in a minute, this deck could take some people by surprise. We saw a player like Brian Colville, when he won here, when we were here 6 months ago with Metalwork Colossus. People weren't prepared for that. Maybe we see something like that again.
Yeah, I mean, eyes are on players like Brendan DeCandio, who has a lot of success with the deck. We saw Pascal Menard, you mentioned, do very well at the Pro Tour. You're right, this deck can be beat when you're targeting for it, but what I really like about it is Teamer is a Jund deck. Going up for a mid-range fight, and God Pharaoh's Gift's going to out mid-range the mid-range deck. If you don't interact with this 7-mana artifact out of their deck, it's going to win or in that turn 7, turn 8, and onward slot.
It's interesting, Ryan, right? Where you kind of know what the known quantities are of the format, then you've got this deck on the sidelines where I think the internal monologue you're having with yourself is, are people going to play this deck? You're kind of hoping the answer is no, probably, so you don't have to bring any sideboard cards to the battle, but there will people who will say, I am going to play this deck, hoping people think like that. Are you one of those players that would say, I hope people just kind of forget this is a deck for this particular weekend?
I think it's certainly a great deck to pick up, and more so than just kind of hoping people don't have the hate, you can actually lean on some of your other spells. Angel of Invention is actually just a fine card in its own right. It's not the most powerful 5 in this format. Obviously, we have Glory Bringers and Scarab Gods, but something you have to remember is that the God Pharaoh's Gift deck can just cast a Scarab God. We saw that out of Brendan DeCandio, where he had kind of a transformational sideboard, and you just have some really good mid-range alternatives where people think that you're cold to a Braid even if they are prepared, and you just start casting really good rates, and you just do all right with your other spells. And also the deck is pretty capable of resetting. Even if you're ready, if they just have Gate to the Afterlife, they can find their gift again, get it back from the graveyard. It's really capable of resetting. You have to actually win the game to put this deck out.
That's true. I think that's one of the things maybe people forget is this is a deck that you can just cast your stuff
Yeah.
and be okay and try to win the game that way. So that'll be a deck that we're going to keep our eyes on here this weekend. But the deck, it's kind of weird. I don't know if we're saving the best for last. Seth Manfield did win the Pro Tour with the Sultai deck. With Hostage Shaker, there's Winding Constrictor, and these various other cards across blue, black, and green. Sultai cards I own, as Patrick has put it so eloquently over the past couple of years. But there are good cards here, Matthias. Is it the best deck in the format? I don't think so. But we can't ignore a card that is as powerful as Hostage Taker, where if people are not prepared for that card, that can win a game or a tournament all by itself.
Yeah, the Winding Constrictor black-green shell has been very playable for a very long time in Standard. And this is really just the next evolution of that strategy. Moved away from Gear Hulks and got lower to the ground. Got to put Rogue Refiner in the deck, which certainly has helped. It's a really powerful card. As I think what we saw with Seth Manfield in winning the Pro Tour was that when it curves out, this deck is still very strong right now. What I'd be worried about in this deck is the more Harness Lightnings, the more Abrades, the more cheap removal you start seeing. That is a warning sign for sleeving this one up.
Well, do you expect to see a lot of that cheap removal here this week? And we talked about Teamer Energy right at the top, Ryan, where it's probably the deck to beat, and then Red's the second best deck to beat. Both those decks have Red. Stands to reason they'll have those cards. Maybe not the right weekend for Sultai?
Yeah, I would certainly say so. You have to dodge a lot of removal spells. The deck does play 4 copies of Blossoming Defense usually, so you can fight those fights, but you're off tempo if you wait until you have another mana up to do that. Your best draws are going to line up very well against basically every deck in the format, but your weaker draws, in particular, if you have a weaker draw where you only have one thing at every point in the curve and you have to wait to set up Blossoming Defense, you just fall really far behind very quickly, whether your opponent's casting Harsh Mentor or Rogue Refiner. These cards, they do a lot of damage. You can't just sit around waiting to cast your spell, certainly if you can't convert your Hostage Taker immediately. So I do think the deck's not in the greatest spot.
For you, Sultai, Hostage Taker, Winding Constrictor, Rishkar, all these other creatures that we've seen in this black-green shell with a small splash of blue. Any strong opinions?
To me, the standard metagame breakdown, it just falls out of how much the teamer decks are fighting against one another. Because the removal spells, by and large, are not great in the mirror match. You want the more impactful threats. When you start moving the deck in that direction, you start running into problems with decks that are going way underneath you or way over the top. This is another option in that space. I think that if you're able to get on the ground fast and just out-tempo these decks that are playing with a bunch of 4s and 5s, that can be a successful strategy. But if the teamer decks have enough respect for other decks where they're playing enough cheap removal to interact, if you're running into a lot of red decks, I think it could be problematic for Sultai Pilots.
Well, those are the 5 decks of our standard metagame breakdown. We are going to prepare for a modern metagame breakdown here in our pregame show in just a moment, where we're going to talk about Death Shadow and Eldrazi-Tron and Storm and all the other fantastic decks of Magic's most popular format. But before we do that, we'll take a short commercial break here, let you hear from some of our sponsors. Then we'll come back and we'll talk modern here in Roanoke.
Go.